Hello everybody, how are you doing today? I hope you're keeping well, and I hope your reading is going well. Today, I wanted to have a little bit of fun by reacting to some outrageous one-star reviews of my favourite books. As you know, my favourite thing in the entire world is to discuss the books I love and to talk about why I love them. I absolutely adore poring over my favourite passages. I love pulling apart resonant lines. I love exploring the different themes of the human condition, and I really love analysing complex characters. And I really love holding great writers up against each other and seeing the great conversation that emerges. And I really love hearing from other readers about the books that they love. But of course, I'm very aware that the books that one reader falls madly in love with won't necessarily resonate with another reader. And in fact, one reader's favourite book could well be the book that another reader detests more than anything in the world. That could well be another reader's least favourite book. And when you fall in love with a specific book, you want everybody else to love it too. Because that book contains something of you, a piece of you. It contains your soul. And so it can be very difficult not to take it personally when another does not love the book that you love, because it's almost like saying they don't love you, or they don't love the element of yourself that you have discovered in that book. But at the same time, it can still be incredibly valuable and instructive to read through hypercritical reviews of the books you love with all your heart, because they will still offer you another perspective on that work and may actually end up making you all the more resolute in your love. Very frequently, the things that reviewers point out as a negative will actually be a huge positive for another reader. Now, I've done this before, and last time I was reacting to one-star reviews of books like Melville's Moby Dick, Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, and Tolstoy's War and Peace. And I enjoyed that so much that today I have asked my editor to pick a whole new set of great books, and I have asked her to curate some one-star reviews from Goodreads for me to react to. Now, I don't know the books that she's picked, and I haven't seen the reviews, so you're going to be getting my first reaction. I do know, however, that these are books that we have lectures and read-throughs for at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. So if you think that these books actually sound rather intriguing, then check out our bookish lectures and discussions at patreon.com/hardcore literature. But let's dive into the reviews now. Okay, we're starting things off with a good one. Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon. We rounded out the year last year with a deep read-through of this sprawling postmodern nightmare, and I can really understand why there would be negative reviews of this book. This is the kind of book that you either love or hate, and even if you love the book, you can of course understand why so many wouldn't. Let's check out the first review, which goes like this: a repulsive, smut-ridden story. Wait, what am I even talking about? There's barely even a comprehensible story here. It's 750 plus pages of random thoughts, repulsively senseless, ultra-graphic, obsessive sexual references, and a stream of consciousness loosely regarding a World War II missile. Well, the thing is, they're not really wrong. They're kind of right there. The book is repulsive and it is smut-ridden. Indeed, that's the reason why Pynchon didn't get the Pulitzer Prize. The Pulitzer Committee said that Gravity's Rainbow was turgid, unreadable, and obscene. And it absolutely is obscene. If you have not read Gravity's Rainbow, then you likely know of its reputation. You expect a book that's going to be challenging and difficult, but perhaps you do not expect it to be incredibly obscene, incredibly vulgar, incredibly disgusting, and it is. Almost every single page has something shocking in it. Goodness, there are several parts of the book that veer so deeply into scatological territory that I personally cannot stomach reading it that closely. When I get to those parts, I kind of glide over the pages. Yeah, okay, I've got it. And I try to get past them. But there are a lot of those scenes. Now, there are so many reasons for why Pynchon might have chosen to stuff Gravity's Rainbow with so much smut. Just to pick one reason that I find particularly striking is Gravity's Rainbow is a comedy. Yeah, it's comic in form. It's a comedy that deals with tragedy, and of course it's detailing the end of the Second World War, but Pynchon was writing Gravity's Rainbow during the height of the Cold War and the Vietnam War era. So the anti-war messages that scream out, that scream across the sky of this novel can apply to any time, any place. They can apply to every single conflict, and they are chilling, they are resonant, they are profound and moving. But the thing is, Fyodor Adorno said that it would be barbaric after Auschwitz to write poetry. After the Second World War, there was a collective uncertainty about where art could go now. After the world had seen such devastation, such atrocities, such evil, could we really proceed to write beautiful books? Now, what Pynchon did is he made his book comic to the proportion of tragedy in the 20th century. And his comedy has to, out of necessity, veer into the grotesque and the vulgar. Now, there are many, many more reasons as to why he stuffed his book with smut, and we spoke about it at length in our book club lecture series. But let's focus on another part of this review. It's barely even comprehensible. 750 plus pages. My version has 902 pages, which certainly is a lot to get through if there's a barely comprehensible story. What Pynchon does, because he is a postmodernist, is he is breaking down the conventions of narrative and character itself. At the beginning, we are following the ostensibly central protagonist, Tyrone Slothrop, and he's trying to discover why he's having a sexual response seemingly connected to the launch of V2 rockets. So he goes on this quest essentially to discover something of himself, but over the course of the narrative, he begins to break down. Quite literally, it's quite disorienting. Pynchon is keen for traditional storytelling techniques to be put through the ringer. He wants to challenge them and overcome them, and throughout the book, yes, there are these really resplendently beautiful scenes, there's some really painful scenes. My goodness, there are few writers who write about heartbreak as poignantly and beautifully and tragically as Pynchon. All of life essentially is in this book. It's what is known as an encyclopedic novel, like Moby Dick. It's comprehensive. That's why it feels so disorienting. It's supposed to be sprawling. It's supposed to encompass a lot of time and a lot of space and a lot of the human condition. What I'm saying is you can absolutely lose yourself in parts of the novel. It can be rather escapist, but predominantly the reader's response to Gravity's Rainbow is an awareness that they are reading a text. It's very meta, and there is a huge defiant challenging of traditional storytelling conventions, which makes it difficult. The review goes on to say, it had a good premise that was entirely undone by the author trying to make some kind of postmodernist art statement through wildly crass imagery. It's like trying to read a World War II novel while standing next to a person with coprolalia, that means the repeated utterance of taboo words, and a megaphone. Yes, it really does feel like that, but it's supposed to be a nightmare. We're supposed to question, what are we reading? Are we reading a vision? There's a deep probing into the unconscious, not just the individual's unconscious, but the collective unconscious. And if you consider Gravity's Rainbow to be like a dream vision, heavily symbolic, no restraints placed on it, then making your way through it becomes, I'm not going to say easier, but it becomes a lot more endurable and also pleasurable at times. But to be honest, I'm actually somewhat with this reviewer. I really like Gravity's Rainbow, but postmodernism is perhaps not my personal favourite era or literary movement, and it's precisely because of the experimentalism, the abstract nature of the narratives, the deliberate flipping of traditional storytelling conventions. I love traditional storytelling conventions. I love those stories where it feels like the writer is sitting across from you and telling you a story once upon a time, and we get to meet some conventional characters. But I do think postmodern literature has its place, and anybody who read Gravity's Rainbow with the book club with us last year probably discovered when they went back into more traditional narratives, like time of recording we're reading East of Eden by John Steinbeck. When you go back into traditional narratives after reading something like this, you get a whole new appreciation for the craft of storytelling. Personally, I think Gravity's Rainbow is a masterpiece, but of course, I definitely understand the criticism levelled against it. Here's another review for Gravity's Rainbow. There is a 15-minute segment About 2/3 of the way through the book, that is about Byron the bulb. That's one of the best bits of the book. That is the only 15 minutes of the book that I probably understood. Yeah, it's actually one of the more lucid parts of the narrative. When it comes to these great books, there are sections that you could almost extract from the entire narrative and appreciate just in and of themselves. And the little story of Byron the bulb is one such section. I think of the Grand Inquisitor prose poem from the brothers Karamazov. That's another section that you can pull out and read in isolation. And it's actually probably a good thing to do if you're feeling like you want to test yourself and you're up for the challenge of tackling one of these big, sprawling, difficult works. Then you could just go to the little sections, the really famous, iconic passages. You could read them in isolation, see what you make of them, and then go to the entire narrative. And having mentioned the brothers Karamazov, I see that that is the next book that we have 1-star reviews for, and honestly, I'm not surprised about that either. I've said before, these are 2 of the top 3 most difficult books I've ever read. You've got Gravity's Rainbow by Pynchon, you've got The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoyevsky, and the third for me is Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, not Ulysses. We read The Brothers Karamazov at the beginning of last year at the book club, and that presented a lot of difficulty, but the difficulty wasn't the difficulty that we would get from Pynchon. Reading Dostoyevsky is a surefire way to induce some spiritual and existential turmoil in oneself. But let's check out the reviews. I'd like to give it 0 stars because I bailed 355 pages in. And each of those pages are so damn dense and torturous. Each one might as well be 2 pages. You know, that's true. So there are different ways to read different books. Different authors demand different approaches. For Dostoyevsky, I find it very useful to sit at a table with a pen in my hand and to really break the story apart on a page-by-page basis. That means you are spending disproportionate time on single pages and paragraphs. You're rereading as you go through, you're making notes. If anything confuses you, you put a star in the margin, you look it up. I think with the Brothers Karamazov, there is a riveting narrative and story there, and it's a story as old as time. Dostoyevsky explores family dynamics, brother-brother relationships, and of course father relationships in a way that would result in Sigmund Freud calling the Brothers Karamazov one of the best works in Western literature, along with Sophocles' Oedipus Rex and Shakespeare's Hamlet. I'm curious to see, they said 355 pages in, that's when they bailed. They got to a bit that I really like, the Parable of the Onion. This means that they also read The Grand Inquisitor, which is honestly one of the most sublime passages in all of literature. They've spent a lot of time with the character of Father Zosima. I would go so far as to say that there is a very strong possibility that this reader might be reading a bad translation. Now, at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, we have a translation comparison, a guide that compares the main translations of Dostoyevsky. I found this is the case for Tolstoy too. When people say, I couldn't read War and Peace, I couldn't get more than a few pages in, had to abandon it, I inevitably always discover that they were reading one of the translations that keeps huge blocks of French in. Yes, Tolstoy used French in War and Peace. The Pavirin Volokonsky keeps it in. For War and Peace, I noticed that readers who struggled with it, using that translation, absolutely fell in love with it when they picked up a translation like the Anthony Briggs. And the same is true for Dostoyevsky. In my opinion, the best translation of Dostoyevsky is Pavirin Volokonsky. I think that Constance Garnett does a great job too, but there are some translations that just make what is already a challenging novel all the more difficult, unnecessarily so. So first things first, when you find you cannot persevere with a book, you should take stock. Check out if it's written in translation, what's the translation? What's the reputation of the translation? Try a few different ones on for size. But dense and torturous are apt words to describe Dostoyevsky. They really are. But the thing that I really love about my reading, it's not always finding the books to be a breeze. It's not always escapism. Yes, I love a bit of escapism and there's nothing wrong with that. As Mortimer Adler said, if we must escape from this reality, we should escape to a higher, more vivid reality. And that's what we get in great literature. But I want my books to offer me a challenge, and I want them to offer me something different. And so at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, as we go through the year, Each book is going to give you something different, and it's going to make you think about different things. It's going to have different challenges, different rewards. And I find that that's a really nice rhythm, to have a variety of experiences. And sometimes we want difficult experiences because difficulty and pain leads to growth. And without a doubt, The Brothers Karamazov is the book that resulted in the most personal growth for me. And it was painful. It wasn't easy. It was a challenge. But let's go on with the review. Life's too short to read books like this. What is it about classics like Les Miserables and Moby Dick and Brothers Karamazov, where they feel the need to describe everyone and everything in the most unnecessary detail? I've noticed that it can take a little bit of effort, it can take a bit of a guide, it can take some perseverance, and it can take some mindset shifts when it comes to approaching classic literature. But what are the commonalities between Moby Dick, Les Miserables and the Brothers Karamazov? Well, firstly, they're all doorstopper books, aren't they? They're huge books. They are trying to be comprehensive, and they are trying to give us an entire world. You're supposed to slow down with these books. The details are the point. You're supposed to read these books and then you go back to your life and you notice the details. Because life, the pleasure of life, is in noticing the small details. Maybe it's the diction. Maybe it hasn't aged well. Maybe I can't be bothered to look up the Wikipedia entries for chapters that I don't understand. Maybe it's because I have to flip to find when a character was introduced to remember who they are. Because I was probably thinking about the last time I was on the beach in Thailand drinking a mojito, instead of paying attention to who this boring, inconsequential character is. Oh, I do love a good mojito myself. So what I do with these big books is when a character is introduced, I put a box around their name, and something that I find really useful to remember characters is to discuss them. Yeah, either discuss them with the people in your life, you may need to persuade them to pick up the book, or discuss them with a community like the Hardcore Literature Book Club community. So when you have a character introduced, Alyosha turns up, Ivan turns up, Dmitri turns up, you discuss that character with other people as though they were real people. If you consider them to be real people, you won't forget them, because we don't forget the real people in our lives. But all of this, of course, takes a lot of commitment and work, but I personally think it pays off in a very big way. The review continues. Maybe it's cognitive dissonance that's made people over time think this book is better than it actually is, because they have to justify taking a month to get through it. Oh my goodness, take longer than a month with Dostoyevsky. Now, I've heard from so many readers who love Dostoyevsky with all their heart and who manage to read a book like this in like a week. I've heard from readers who have inhaled Dostoyevsky over the course of a couple of days. I can't do that. I've got to take months with him, rereading him, and I do recommend with something like this, taking at least 2 months, but preferably a bit longer. And that's the thing about classic literature. When I returned to it in a really big way, a couple of years after graduating from university, I found that classic literature demanded me to strip down how much I was reading. I had to cull my reading lists. I was reading hundreds of books a year, but by the end of the year I couldn't remember any of them. So I decided to be super faithful to just a handful of books, and I went from reading hundreds of books a year to just carefully picking half a dozen books. And if you only read half a dozen books per year, you have to pick really good ones, and of course you're going to spend a lot more time with them. You're not trying to just get through them. You can't just get through a book like The Brothers Karamazov because it demands you to reread it endlessly over the course of your life. The review ends by saying, maybe this book just isn't for me. Not going to lie, it was liberating to pull the chute on this one. Can't wait to start a new book. Yeah, well, fair enough. I think these books find us at the right time in our lives. I'm a big proponent of, if you can't persevere with a book, put a little mental pin in it and try to return to it a couple years later after you've accrued different lived experience, and you might find that the book is different because you're different. Now, there's another review, a shorter one, for Dostoyevsky's masterpiece, which goes like this. I've got to stop kidding myself that I will ever finish this. This is one of the worst books I ever read. Shame on you, Mr. Dostoyevsky. Well written, but the characters are all dislikable. Selfish beasts, you know? At least they're saying that it was well written. The funny thing about Dostoyevsky is his style, I wouldn't necessarily say it's well written, it's jagged. It's polyphonic, it's disorienting, it feels like a cacophony of voices just coming at you. It's quite grotesque, but of course that is his art, that's his artifice, it's deliberate. This reviewer is correct, the characters are dislikable. Yeah, That's the point, and actually that's kind of the point with so many of these great books. I've seen with the negative reviews of many of these books, the readers just don't like the characters. I remember this because we read reviews for Wuthering Heights in our last 1-star review video, and the main criticism was, oh, I just hate all of these characters. But that is the point. These characters are supposed to be, sometimes, detestable. I don't think it would be too interesting if we were just reading about happy, well-adjusted, perfect people all the time. Maybe sometimes we want that, but sometimes we want to spend some time with some villains, no? When we watch a Shakespeare play, who do we watch for? When we watch Othello and Desdemona, they're really incredible characters, but we wait for Iago, the Machiavellian web spinner. The review ends by saying all the characters are dislikable except the priest, who is some weird, superstitious magician, and the youngest son, who is an overly naive guy who never takes a stand. Yeah, I mean, Alyosha, he's the overly naive guy, he's the religiously pure guy, and he's not as interesting as, say, Ivan Karamazov, who is going through this existential turmoil. He's not as interesting as Dmitri, who hates his father, the sensualist. He hates him because, hey, they're kind of a bit too alike, you know what I mean? But the thing about Alyosha is, Dostoyevsky was actually going to do a part 2 to this book. This was not just the story as is. He wanted to keep writing it, and Alyosha's character was going to develop, he was going to change, but unfortunately, Dostoyevsky died before he could bring that into the world, which is a great shame, and that means that we have to hypothesize as to how that book might have gone. Let's move on to another review. This is for Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. I can almost hear the collective gasp in response to hearing that anybody disliked Jane Eyre. We read this over the course of autumn at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, and I must say that Jane Eyre was a smash hit. This was a book that had one of the most positive, the most overwhelmingly positive and loving responses that I've ever seen. There are a handful of books that have disproportionately solicited huge amounts of love from practically everybody who has read them with us at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. Jane Eyre was one of those books. Paradise Lost got a lot of love. Shakespeare gets a lot of love. We're reading East of Eden by Steinbeck at the moment, and readers are absolutely inhaling that book. So this will be interesting. Let's see what this reviewer says about Jane Eyre. The writing style is of great quality and far above the average capability of the modern writer. Brontë is very descriptive and uses great sentence structures and an extensive vocabulary, much as I would expect from an author of that era, unlike Jane Austen, which I read just before. Well, Charlotte Brontë will be happy to know that she has beaten Jane Austen in this reader's mind. Charlotte came to Jane's works rather late and ended up disparaging them, and I think that's because she saw Austen doing a lot of things that she was doing, but of course she got there first. That is all the positive commentary I have for this novel. This is a story about an abusive relationship. Eyre seems to be delusional, maybe Stockholm Syndrome. She completely venerates Rochester, who is a liar and a narcissist. He's very dominating and depreciates Jane. He is almost abusive in his language towards her. And just before I read any more, it looks like we're going to be getting into spoiler territory with this book. So I would highly recommend, if you haven't read Jane Eyre and you want to preserve the plot details, you want the surprises to be in store, when you come to it, you might want to go on a little bit. You might even want to go on to the next book. This review continues and says, Rochester tries to trick Jane into marriage even though he's already married. So romantic. His treatment of his previous wife is disturbing, and there's a really weird part where he dresses up as a gypsy fortune teller to find out if Jane has feelings for him. Also, his regard for previous lovers and the part where he tries to make Jane jealous don't paint him in a positive light. Well, Rochester is a Byronic protagonist, and I do find it interesting that there is so much love for these Byronic protagonists, because if they were not characters, there is no way anybody would want to have anything to do with them. Now, Rochester isn't quite as bad as Emily Bronte's Heathcliff. My goodness. Heathcliff clearly came from a really dark place inside of Emily. Charlotte based Rochester on the man that she loved, and her love was unrequited. And what happened was Charlotte would channel that unrequited love, that energy, into Jane Eyre, into the story. It was almost like she could talk to the man who did not love her in fiction, and she could give herself a happy ending. Rochester's behaviour is horrific and would definitely fit the patterns of an abusive relationship. He's manipulative, he is narcissistic, although he does have the capacity to change, and he does change over the course of the novel, as does Jane. What's interesting is Jane wholeheartedly loves him, but she stays true to herself. She loves herself, respects herself more than her love for Rochester. And yes, Rochester is already married, and he doesn't see any way to be with Jane whilst that is the case. So he ends up tricking her. When she finds out and refuses, of course, he says, well, maybe you could be my mistress, maybe we could pretend you're my wife in spirit, and we'll just forget about my other wife. There's been a lot of discussion around Rochester's wife, Bertha Mason, the mad woman in the attic. If you read Jane Eyre closely, from Rochester's point of view, he himself was duped into that marriage. He was tricked by his family and her family, and he's been very, very unhappy for many, many years. And during the time that Charlotte was writing, divorce wasn't easy, it wasn't commonplace, and unless Bertha died, Rochester was trapped. And of course, Bertha is struggling with a lot of severe mental health issues. And again, if you know what mental health care was like in the 19th century, you'll know that her life wouldn't have been particularly good if Rochester had just disburdened himself of his responsibility for her. If he had put her in an institution, he actually chose to look after her and keep her attended to. But the issue, of course, is he kept it secret. And another review has simply put, 1 star is for Bertha. If you're interested, there's a book called Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys that tells the story from Bertha's point of view. But let's go on to our next review, which is for John Steinbeck's East of Eden. At time of recording, this is our big read at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, and the love readers have for this book is incredible. And many have not wanted to slow down, they haven't wanted to pace their reading out. Indeed, many steamed on ahead and inhaled this book. They finished it very quickly and are now rereading it. But I have a feeling that I may know what things a 1-star review of this book will point out. Let's have a look. The review goes like this. I can't stand this book. There's something almost obscene about it. John Steinbeck hates women in a childish, self-pitying way that's almost comically over the top. Well, what comes through in the book, and it comes through very strongly, is Steinbeck's hatred for his ex-wife, his second wife. And that comes through in the character of Cathy Ames, who I think is one of the beating hearts of this story. Most of the women in this story are two-dimensional. Steinbeck paints them as religiously faithful and rather joyless, and he doesn't give them much of a personality, though of course he did stress in his letters to his editor that his people were symbol people, and the only reason why he wanted to try to make them psychologically complex is because he wanted to convey the symbolic message. And so if you enjoy reading a story where the people feel like real people, then the allegorical meaning, the metaphorical meaning can take root more easily, and then you can think about it later, you can think about it as you reread. But one of the most striking characters, one of the most captivating characters is Cathy, who Steinbeck depicts as the personification of evil. Cathy has a complete inability to empathise with other people and to feel warmth for them. Interestingly, when she interacts with a character who also lacks empathy, or she interacts with a character who despises her, or hates her, or speaks rudely to her, that's the only time where she thinks, I like that person. She likes them because she understands them. What she does not understand, Cathy, is when others are warm to her. She doesn't understand love and affection. She sees the world through a very harsh, cold prism. And though Cathy would never feel any warmth for me, and she wouldn't understand the warmth I have to other people, when I read this book I cannot help but feel sorry for her. I do feel pity for her. And Steinbeck uses this character to go back and forth on the nature-nurture debate. Are we the way we are because we're born so, or are we made so? The character of Cathy was inspired by Steinbeck's second wife, and they had a really tumultuous relationship on both ends. Neither was a saint. Both of them brought issues to the relationship. Up until this point in Steinbeck's life, He'd never had a good relationship with a woman. He'd never felt at peace with a woman. He never felt secure or warm. And around the time of writing East of Eden, and I think it's interesting to note that two of his masterpieces were both written around the time he was going through a divorce, East of Eden and The Grapes of Wrath. Around the time of writing this one, he fell in love with another woman, his third wife. And for the first time in his life, he would feel security and warmth and love and affection. So he was most certainly working through his issues with women in this book, and we see that. So I completely understand that. Let's check out the next review for East of Eden. I like Winnie the Pooh as much as the next person, but a novel where 75% of the characters are playing the role of Eeyore and another 20% are refugees from some kind of mental treatment facility doesn't make for an enjoyable experience. Obviously, East of Eden is Steinbeck's extension of and repackaging of his response to the Cain and Abel story, but I suppose we could read this as a perverted Winnie the Pooh, where every character is Eeyore. That's true, there's a lot of depression in this novel. The characters deal with a lot of mental health issues at a time when society didn't really make it okay to discuss that sort of thing, or people didn't really understand these issues of depression and trauma. Steinbeck explores all of that. Now, let's go on to the next review. And we've got another one that has seemingly ubiquitous love and acclaim. I'm actually more interested in the reviews that go after the books that everyone loves than books like The Brothers Karamazov or Gravity's Rainbow, because you kind of expect negative reviews for those books. But this next book is The Count of Monte Cristo. Again, we read this at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. That was our summer read last year, and all of those lectures are instantly accessible on demand at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. This was another one that readers really fell in love with. This was quite a story, and it's one that I'm going to endlessly reread over the course of my life. I absolutely love the characters. I love Edmond Dantes, and I sympathise with his plight. But this review says, the writing was good. Plot was interesting. However, it left me with a bad taste in my mouth. Yeah, the writing is okay with Alexandre Dumas. I think he wasn't super focused on making beautiful sentences and flowery language. He wasn't a prose stylist. He was a storyteller, and that actually got him a lot of negative criticism during his day, because he would just churn out hundreds and hundreds of stories. He had a ghostwriting team, a team of storytellers, and he worked relentlessly on the plot beats for his story. So when you read an Alexandre Dumas novel, it has a good pace, it moves along at a fair trot, there's conflict, you want to know what happens next, and there are cliffhangers aplenty. But for this reviewer, the story left a bad taste in their mouth, because the Count of Monte Cristo is a villain. This guy is pure evil. Before I continue, this may get sort of into spoiler territory, but I don't really think so, because I think going into the story, everybody knows that it is a revenge narrative. That's what the story's all about. He makes himself out to be the hand of God when he enacts his revenge fantasy on his friends and their families. It was a strange read, because, of course, the Count of Monte Cristo is the hero. Well, that's interesting. So, firstly, he was locked up unfairly, wrongly imprisoned in the Chateau d'If for 14 years. His enemies thought they could lock him away and that would be the end of it. And, of course, when he gets out, there is hell to pay. And what we see in the Count of Monte Cristo is like the origin of the superhero story. He is an anti-hero, which means that there are villainous aspects to him. No, he's not a Boy Scout. No, he's not completely pure. Yes, he has a sense of monomania. He does see himself as the hand of God. If you were locked up 14 years unjustly, you might also find yourself fantasizing about revenge, and you might find yourself gripped by delusions of grandeur. Edmond Dantes has to be flawed. Yeah, he is an anti-hero. And because that's the case, there's a lot of room for character growth and development and change. Because that's the point. Alexandre Dumas takes this premise of revenge being a dish best served cold and explores it. Is it really? Is revenge really satisfying? Does it satisfy us deep inside? So quite honestly, I think this is partly the response that Alexandre Dumas wanted from his readers, but it's also supposed to be a bit of a fantasy. Today we'll watch a Quentin Tarantino movie and we'll suspend willingly our sense of disbelief and we'll just go with it. But here's another review, negative one, for The Count of Monte Cristo. I understand that this novel was written almost 200 years ago and published in instalments, like a soap opera. But that doesn't explain why this book has lasted. The book's considered a literary classic today, but I don't get it. It's obvious Dumas was paid by the word. The story itself could have been a great adventure of revenge, love and forgiveness, but the twists of plot were so unbelievable that it made the novel ridiculous. Yes, I think Dumas was paid by the word, but it was the soap opera of the day. Like with a Dickens novel, readers would feverishly await the next instalment, whether it was weekly or monthly, and then they would talk about it in the interim. They would read these stories aloud to their loved ones, and they would hypothesize what's going to happen next, what characters do you like. And personally, I adore serialized literature, but I understand. The twists of the plot were unbelievable. So Dumas is being very melodramatic. Yes, this is a story. It's not realist. He's more in the romance camp, yeah, and we can trace romance back to tales of chivalry, tales of knight-errants, quest narratives and so forth. You're supposed to suspend your sense of disbelief. And the writer makes a bit of a pact with the reader and basically says, I'm going to tell you something amazing, something fantastic, and you just have to go with it. And the reader says, yeah, okay, I'll do that. But there is a little caveat, because we don't want it to be too fantastic. We don't want to have to stretch our imagination too far. Even in our fiction, we do demand some sense of realism. We don't want to think, oh, that would never happen. And I could understand why The Count of Monte Cristo could be seen to have some ridiculous elements to it, but I love all that. I really love that kind of storytelling. The many disguises of the Count, the drug-induced coma, the entire business in the dungeon, it was just too stupid to be taken seriously, so why is it a literary classic? There are academic critics that scorn The Count of Monte Cristo, calling it the Victorian version of pulp, essentially. Many critics would say that it's not Hamlet, and indeed Alexandre Dumas loved Hamlet, loved Shakespeare, but does everything need to be? Sometimes we just want a good story, a riveting story. We want to hurtle through an imaginary world. We want to have a little bit of escapism. Let's go on to another book. This one is Dracula by Bram Stoker. Now, when it comes to Dracula, I personally think that the first chapters with Jonathan Harker's journal are superb. I think they're really, truly amazing. The rest of the book, maybe not so much. Bram Stoker disproportionately focused on the beginning of the story, which was originally a short story, and then it got beyond him. The rest of the novel sort of veers into complete absurdism, and that's fine. And of course, Dracula, along with Frankenstein, is one of the most influential horror stories of all time. And we must thank Stoker for what he has gifted us, what he has gifted the world of film. But I do think there is a jarring gulf of difference when it comes to quality between the beginning of Dracula and the end. And I'm interested to see what reviewers disliked about Dracula. Great beginning, but shortly after events switch to London, the writing descends into tedious and poorly written melodrama and just plain bad dialogue, especially Van Helsing's. Yeah, I mean, I can't fault them there, I agree. Here's another review for Dracula. I am mad at this book. It's boring and horrid and slow-paced, and it can honestly drive any sane person into a state of catatonic apathy that will never fade away. First of all, this whole epistolary style thing doesn't work. So epistolary style, that's when a narrative is told using letters or diary entries, that sort of thing. I think it does work, and some of my favourite books are told using the epistolary, like Samuel Richardson's Clarissa. I think it works to create tension, because it feels very immediate. It feels like we're reading something that's kind of happening right now. But the reader goes on and says, most of the time it's inconceivable that every single character of the story stops in their tracks to write a full-fledged report of what went on in their day, as they're always busy being the worst vampire hunters to ever grace the earth. This is true. There are parts of Dracula where they're writing, like with Jonathan Harker's stories. Oh, Dracula, Count Dracula's at the door, he's coming, I hear him. And you think, maybe put the pen down for a moment, yeah? Sort yourself out, and then if you survive and you get out of there safely, then record what's going on. So I get that. I understand the criticism of the epistolary narrative, but you can do a really cool thing with books like Dracula. You can line up your reading with the real dates. You can read Dracula, for example, in real time and just read the instalments that are corresponding to the actual date, the time that you're living your life. That's a lot of fun. Now we have a review for Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Every year at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, we have a seasonal Dickens. We end the year with a rereading of A Christmas Carol and we embark upon a new Dickens novel. We've read Great Expectations, The Unfinished Mystery of Edwin Drood, and last year we read Tale of Two Cities. Let's see what this reviewer has to say. So full of melodrama, inaccuracies, improbabilities, convenient coincidences, one big pushover of a hero, and a heroine too stupid to die for. But above all, the history twisted at will to fit the story, it's beyond salvaging due to the pile of mistakes, deliberate or not. That's the thing with Dickens. He gets away with a lot of things that if another writer did it, they wouldn't get away with it. Dickens does get away with melodrama. He does get away with inaccuracies and improbabilities, although he fell in love with Thomas Carlyle's The French Revolution. He was absolutely obsessed with this era, this turbulent period of history, the Reign of Terror. And so, of course, there are going to be inaccuracies by virtue of the fact that he couldn't be comprehensive. This is not one of Dickens's big sprawling works. He portioned it out in teaspoons. And typically he would release his books on a monthly schedule, but for this one he tried to do a weekly release, which almost killed him. But it's a very compressed narrative, and he covers a lot of ground. He sweeps over the years, so of course he's going to have to deliberately choose what to focus on and what to exclude. Convenient coincidences? Yep, that's Dickens all over. He is absolutely full of those. One big pushover of a hero. Well, the thing with Sidney Carton, who Dickens had fantasies of playing, he wanted A Tale of Two Cities to be produced as a play. He was actually starring in a play at the time, his friend's Wilkie Collins's play, and so he had drama on his mind. So if A Tale of Two Cities feels quite theatrical, that's the reason. He fantasised about playing Sidney Carton. Yes, there might be some improbabilities, but it's supposed to be metaphorical. The story is about rebirth, it's about change, it's about sacrificing yourself for love. But of course, a bit of melodrama is not going to go down well with everybody. We have another review for A Tale of Two Cities, short one, that goes like this. When you're cheering on Madame Defarge, you know you hate this book. Yeah, Madame Defarge, a very frightening personage. Was this reader cheering her on? Okay, let's move on to the next book. Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. We read this last year at the book club. I absolutely love Ellison's prose. There's something of the Whitmanian running through his work. Reading his prose is like listening to jazz. And you've got the philosophy of American transcendentalism running through his work too. I absolutely love this book. This review goes like this. I feel really bad, but I can't take this anymore. This is a classic and most people say it's eye-opening and an important piece of literature. I can see why it was important when it was published. It focuses on racial issues in a time when the US was still plagued with Jim Crow laws. Yeah, he wrote Invisible Man in the 50s. Martin Luther King Jr. had yet to give his I Have a Dream speech. Segregation was still ongoing. The review continues. That being said, it's not well written. The book should have been 200 pages shorter, and I was disappointed by the plot and prose. Oh my goodness, I couldn't imagine Invisible Man being 200 pages shorter. Personally, the thing with Invisible Man is, it's like a picaresque, yeah? So you're following the same character, and the character's going through all these different changes, and typically in a picaresque the character's a little bit of a rascal. And the narrative, yes, it follows a sort of chronology. It is kind of like a Bildungsroman. We see the growth of the protagonist, their inner growth and so forth. But the episodes that are detailed almost feel a little bit disjointed or a little bit disconnected. You can just read certain chapters extricated from the entire book, and so the book Invisible Man feels like a jazz album, and each chapter feels like a new song. And there is a unity, there are themes that overlap and run through the entire thing, but that explains, I think, that criticism on the plot. I don't understand not liking the prose though. I think it's absolutely gorgeous, especially if you read it aloud or listen to it read aloud. But let's go on to the next review that goes like this. Symbolism, symbolism, symbolism. But no story. There is a lot of symbolism. And we could say that Ellison's a little bit heavy-handed with the symbolism, but does symbolism need to be subtle? Yeah, it doesn't have to be. It can be overt, that's fine. I think there is a story though. There's a story of this one man's journey to accept himself. All of his life, he looks to other people to tell him who he is. The story's about identity. Who am I? Yeah, he's trying to follow other people. He's trying to fit in. He's trying to be accepted in different crowds, different groups. But over the course of the story, he comes to realise that he has to accept himself first and foremost. This is Emerson's self-reliance packaged up in a narrative. And I think it's a story that we can all relate to. Next up, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. We're reading this with the Hardcore Literature Book Club. In the spring, at time of recording, we're reading Steinbeck. Then we're going to move on to Bulgakov with The Master and Margarita. And then we're going to embark upon Pride and Prejudice. The first review goes like this. Flowery, pretentious writing does not a good story make. Austen created stiff, one-dimensional characters, brought them to life as much as she could in a boring plot, and had two of them fall in love, somehow. No one writes romance colder than Austen did. Now, I think I can give a little bit of a nuanced perspective on this because I actually didn't like Austen myself when I first read her, and now I absolutely adore her works. My first reading of Jane Austen was Pride and Prejudice, and it was part of my school syllabus. And apart from one other guy who hardly ever turned up, the whole class was women, and the teacher was a woman, and the story is heavily catered towards women readers predominantly. So you can imagine a young boy who's reading Nietzsche and Hemingway, who's reading Joseph Conrad and Jack Kerouac. You can imagine that a young boy's not going to fall madly in love with this story, and I had the same opinions. Now, I didn't think that the writing was flowery or pretentious. I don't think Austen is flowery. I don't think she's overtly ornate. I don't think she shows off. I think she's actually very subtle. But I really didn't like the romance plot, and I couldn't abide how much love there was for this story because everybody in the class was fawning over Mr. Darcy, and I didn't get it. Luckily, I did return to Austen significantly many years later, and it was actually her quiet, autumnal masterpiece, Persuasion, that made me fall in love with her works. After that, I could read absolutely everything that she produced, and what a shame she didn't write more. She didn't live long enough to produce more, and I loved each and every story madly. I love Emma, Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, and of course, Pride and Prejudice. I love Northanger Abbey. But last year, I reread Pride and Prejudice 3 times back to back, and I don't normally do that. I don't normally get to the end of a book and then immediately turn to the first page and do it all over again. But for Pride and Prejudice, I did. And I found the story to be uplifting. I found the energy to be captivating and intoxicating. I loved how bubbling and sparkling the wit in the story was. And most of all, I fell in love with the characters. Elizabeth Bennet, who has Shakespearean inwardness running through her. We can find her literary heritage in Shakespeare's Rosalind in As You Like It. I loved Mr. Darcy. I loved Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. I loved seeing elements of myself and my family and the world in this story. In short, I found it to be so delightful that I simply had to reread it again and again and again, and each time I found something new. And so when we come to the Pride and Prejudice lecture series at the Hardcore Literature Book Club this year, my aim is going to be not just appreciating the book with those who already love it. Of course, many readers are going to have read this 100 times. Many readers are already primed to give it another good rereading. They already love it. I have a subsidiary aim, and that is to ensure that anybody who doesn't quite get Austen just yet falls in love with her, because I tell you, one of the best experiences in my entire reading life has been going from disliking Austen to loving her works intensely, and I want more people to fall in love with her the way I have. Next, we have Paradise Lost by John Milton. One of the greatest epics ever written, and after Shakespeare, Milton is most likely the greatest writer of English. You read Paradise Lost and it's just astonishing how something so sprawling, so lengthy, so comprehensive and sweeping can also be so compressed, because on a line-by-line basis there is no slack word, no slack syllable, there's no word that's out of place. Each and every line is perfect. But this review says, having read this right after reading the biblical version of creation in Genesis, my first thought was, what nerve this Milton guy has. First, he takes a story that comprises 1.5 pages in the Bible and makes it insufferably long. Well, to today's readers, it would definitely seem so. 12 books long. Also, the assumptions he makes that are not in the Bible are definitely questionable. The 2 assumptions he makes that I found particularly irksome were his depiction of Eve and his inclusion of Jesus in an Old Testament story. Milton read scripture and he absolutely blew it up. He swelled it to an enormous size. And Ignatius of Loyola would recommend readers of the Bible to really flex their imagination, to embrace all of their senses, to see and hear and smell, and to read between the lines too. And we can see that Milton really read between the lines. And the result is, today when we think about biblical stories and characters, we are very often, unwittingly, actually thinking about Milton's representation rather than the biblical representation. This is most striking when it comes to Satan. Percy Bysshe Shelley was right when he said, the devil owes everything to Milton's Satan. Milton's Satan has Iago in there, and also Macbeth and Hamlet. He's absolutely racked with inner pain and turmoil, and even when he breaks free of hell and he makes it to paradise, he brings hell with him and realises that heaven and hell are states of mind. Everywhere he goes, he is in hell. But of course, in the original Genesis story of the fall of mankind, the serpent in the garden isn't overtly clarified as being Satan. So that's a really sublime Miltonic addition. And indeed, in the Old Testament, we can look at depictions of Satan, like in the Has-Satan figure in the book of Job, and we can see that Satan was more like God's right-hand man, rather than a full-on villain or antagonist. Whereas in Paradise Lost, Satan is vying for supremacy with the Almighty. He's jealous of Jesus, the Son of God. And so his fall from grace, his fall from heaven, is a grand overture to the fall of mankind. And of course, at the time, many readers were concerned that what Milton was doing was blasphemous. And Milton was no stranger to controversy. Indeed, he had written a tract on regicide, the killing of kings, which, with the restoration of the monarchy, ended up landing the blind poet in jail with the threat of being executed for treason. Now, luckily they didn't, and they let him go, and so we have Paradise Lost today. And as I said, Paradise Lost was one of those works that really resonated with so many readers in the book club last year. I think a lot of readers were surprised at how something that had a reputation for being difficult and dense and elusive, because it's packed not only with biblical allusions but classical allusions too. I think many readers were surprised at how much pleasure could be gained from chanting Milton aloud and poring over his poetry. Now I'm going to leave it there for today, but what did you make of the reviews? If any of these books mentioned are your favourites, I would love to hear what you have to say. Do you agree with any aspects of those negative reviews? And indeed, if you haven't read some of these books and they sound intriguing, then we have book club lectures and we have read-throughs and content. We have bookish discussions for them at patreon.com/hardcore literature. At time of recording, we are deep reading East of Eden, and we are also appreciating the poetry of Walt Whitman. We're relishing Shakespeare, and we've got some really exciting writers up ahead. We're going to read Bulgakov, we're going to read The Tale of Genji, we're reading Jane Austen, Thomas Hardy, David Foster Wallace later in the year. We're going to read Toni Morrison together, we're going to read Dante, and many more. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for watching and reading along. I appreciate you, and I hope you have a lovely day. Happy reading, everybody, and bye-bye for now.